So things can come and go out of fashion pretty quick, whether that's clothes or whether it's some kind of other thing that has entered into our culture and our society. They can come and go pretty quick. Let me give you a few examples. How often did you play Angry Birds when you were a kid? Or maybe that was just me when it was out. But everybody, it seemed, was playing Angry Birds at some stage. I'm not sure anybody plays Angry Birds anymore. What about these things that we used to hold like this and then spin them around? That's right. I'm guessing maybe you had a couple of fidget spinners knocking around when you were a kid. Certainly they were everywhere. You don't see any fidget spinners anymore. Whenever I was a kid in the playground, whenever I was in like junior infants, maybe a little bit older, it was yo-yos. Coca-Cola used to produce all these different yo-yos. You used to collect them, and there were different kinds of special editions ones, and everybody was playing with yo-yos in the playground. You don't see a yo-yo about really anymore. What about now whenever we have Spotify? We don't really think about anything else. We don't need to think about CDs or discs. But whenever I was younger, there was like portable CD players and there was MP3 players, and that's how we listen to our music. Nobody has them anymore because we don't need them. We all take videos and stuff on our phones because the cameras are so good, but actually we used to have these things called camcorders. Your parents probably took videos of you when you were a baby, and they used to be everywhere and they were so popular, but of course you don't see a camcorder really anymore. We talked about Diego Maradona last week, and whenever he was playing football, every footballer, it seemed, had a perm. They had curly hair. Right now, footballers just tend to have a skin fade or whatever else it may be. You don't see a permed hairdo on a dude anymore. It's kind of gone out of fashion. And clothes are the same, and clothes can come and go. So like baggy jeans were in, and then it was skinny jeans, and now baggy jeans are back to being a thing. And in the 60s and 70s, it was flares. There were flare jeans, and of course they're kind of coming back in a little bit as well. We're going to look at something that was in fashion and really common back in the day. In ancient times, it was really common that people would have wanted and desired and craved wisdom. Even throughout the Bible, you would see people ask God for wisdom. Wisdom was not just a character that kind of spiritual people wanted, but wisdom was something that actually society back in the ancient days, they really desired and craved that. If you asked people today in society what kind of things would they like the most, you'd probably get answers like success, wealth, happiness. Wisdom wouldn't be too high up on people's priority lists. But actually it was something that it was really craved back in the day. And we're going to look at wisdom. We're going to look at what it means. But we're going to read and see what James has to say about it. But you might be surprised about what James talks about wisdom actually being. You see, you might be sitting kind of thinking wisdom, book smarts, all that kind of stuff, intelligence. James doesn't talk about that when he talks about wisdom. Let's see what he talks about. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So there we can see that James talks about two kinds of wisdom. One that comes from above, one that's godly. It's a godly kind of wisdom, and one that is an earthly kind of wisdom. And this godly wisdom from above, James says, who is wise among you? Let them show it by their good life, by their deeds. Let them show it by humility that comes from wisdom. You see, right there, nowhere does James talk about wisdom being about intelligence. Nowhere does he talk about it being about being smart. He talks about wisdom being from our character. And then when we drop down to verses 16 and 17, he talks about the fruit of our lives. He talks about character and wisdom being so joined together that they're not really separable. James is talking about wisdom as being how we act, how we are. And again, he's talking about this idea of humility, of gentleness, of patience, of peace, of self-control. All these things again that Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, that Paul talks about in Galatians. Wisdom is about how we live our lives. Not about what's up here, but what develops through our character and through who we are and through what we do. So we can see that wisdom is not self-fulfilling, but wisdom looks outside ourselves. So what about the opposite? What about this earthly wisdom, which he calls it sort of demonic and unspiritual? What does he say about that? Well, if we look at verse 14, he talks about it being self-fulfilling. He talks about it being self-centered. If we live a life that is about ourselves or that's full of envy, well, it is what leads to disorder. There's two stark differences that James talks about here about wisdom. One is about our character and goodness and good deeds, and one is about selfishness, selfish ambition. And he says whenever selfish ambition reigns, whenever it is there, well then what comes is disorder, and nothing good comes from that. I was watching Match of the Day in case you don't know, I like football. I'm not sure if it's come across in, any talk that I've done or as you talk about me, but I was watching Match of the Day the other night. And before Match of the Day is the BBC News. I know some guy talking to you about the BBC News, but bear with me. There were these two articles that were on, one after the other. And I thought these two stories really highlighted what James was talking about here. The first story was about poverty and the pandemic. And it went to this really, really poor area of England in Burnley. And it concentrated on these two men who happened to be men who worked for churches. And they were so struck and they were so sad and devastated by how the pandemic had not just affected the poor people, but how it had made the poor people in that area even more poor. And so the news story was about these two guys, and it travelled around with them a little bit, and it showed the work that they had been doing. They had been filling up their cars, they had been going to see people, and they had been going to take food to these people and to these families. And there was one story that really struck with me. He said that whenever he would have gone into some families, the kids would have almost ripped the shopping bags apart because they hadn't seen food in so long. And I looked at this guy and I thought, here's a wise man. Here's a man who is not living out of selfish ambition. Here's a man who is pure, and here's a man who is living by doing what is right. Here's a man who's living a good life by his deeds. His heart is broken for the brokenness that he sees around him, and he's doing something about it. And it was one of those things that actually was really difficult to watch. But as I came away, I kind of go, gosh, here's a man who's living as James is calling us to live. He's living a wise life. Remember that James talks about a wise life is about our good deeds and the fruit from our lives. The next story in the news, it actually couldn't have been more different. The next story, the newsreader said, and this is not me, taking down this person's character at all, because she's done lots of good things. But here's what it was. Rita Ora has apologised for having a lavish 30th birthday in a London restaurant in a gathering. And I kind of thought to myself, do you see the contrast of the two stories there? Here we have one man or two men who are trying to live a life to help people. And here we have a rich person whose birthday it is, who's having a lavish, selfish get-together with their friends in the middle of a pandemic. And I thought to myself, there's two opposites. One is about selfishness. And actually, as I listened to that story, I was angry, I was cross, because she just put herself in front, line and center and didn't really care about anything else that was going on. And then there's these two guys who are trying to do their best for these people. And here's the point I want to make out of that. And again, Rita Ora has done great stuff, right? So this is not me cutting her down to pieces. But here's the thing I want to say, is that if we look at our society, which of these two characters does our society lift up? Which of our society, of these two characters, will get more headlines? Which of our society will we look at and be like, I want to be like them? Most of us will look at it like, I want to be famous, I want to be glamorous, I want to be rich. And so Rita Ora is kind of what we then try to be. It's what we then look at. We kind of look at fame and we look at celebrity status and we kind of go, that is the gold standard. That is what we should be shooting for. Because that's what's put out to us on social media or whatever else it may be. But actually, these two men, they will go unnoticed. They will go unnoticed in our society. And I'm not saying that they will want all the headlines, but James is saying, if we look at these two people through the lens of wisdom, who should we want to be more like as believers? The answer is the people who have good deeds front and center of their lives, people who are humble, people who are not selfish. We don't stand a chance if we start to glamorize the rich and the famous, because we'll always look at that and be like, I want to be like that. I want to be rich. I want to be all about me. And whenever James talks about that, he says, selfish ambition, it leads to disorder. And that's what happened. There were people outraged by what Rita Ora had done because it was selfish and it was wrong. But these two guys, this is what James is talking about as a wise life. By our deeds, by our humility, by the things that we do. Wisdom is about our character.